I am so honored and happy to introduce my colleague and dear friend, Teresa Grossi. She has so many areas of talent and expertise and her values and her caring for individuals with disabilities, especially around transition to adulthood and adulthood issues. And I asked her to do this for us because as we sat around it as a staff and as we get phone calls in from different family members, the call that we oftentimes get is we have, a parent will call me and say, we have a son or a daughter who is 25 years old sitting in the basement and not doing anything. And when I ask about the transition planning process that they went through, they often don't understand what that really was as part of the school years. And so, I really am so committed to making sure that our individuals have successful life post-school. And so Teresa is going to be talking to you about planning for a lifetime and transition planning. So Teresa, I'm going to pull up your handout.
I just sent you my slides.
Right.
So while we're waiting on Kathy, and thank you all for having me. And I could talk, as Kathy will say, I'm a talker, and I could talk about this for forever. And Kathy, if you could put this as that slideshow. And so I think I want to just start with the title I put in is Preparing for Life After High School, a Shared Responsibility. And through my long years of thinking about transition, working as a transition coordinator, being in the trenches before it even came into law, walking through that law piece, what I've learned is that no one could do this alone. Schools can't do it alone, families can't do it alone. And so it really is that shared responsibility. So Kath, if you do the slideshow up above and start with what I hope to accomplish. At the top is that slideshow. Can you put it into slideshow mode? Yes, that's it. That's perfect. Thank you. So I'm not going to get into all the specific details. So this is going to be that brushstroke of really next month, we're going to talk a little bit more about the components of the transition IEP and some of the requirements that are so key. And I'm going to talk also both today and next week about those best practices and what should happen both during those school years and then afterwards. Next slide. I don't think I could slide the next slide, Kath. Can you? With that arrow? Kath, can you go to the next slide?
I am sliding it. I don't know what's going on.
And it just went away.
I was seeing it roll, Kathy.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So when I think about transition, and what I've learned over the years is that we can't think about it right when a child turns 14, when IDEA says that's what's required. What we have to think about it as that lifetime approach, a lifespan approach. And I love when I talk about with early childhood families who have kids in early childhood and elementary, and I start talking about what is that big picture? What does that look like? And that's what's so important, is that we start having that vision in the very beginning. So, Kath, is there a way you can go back a little bit? You sort of jumped some slides here. So one of the things, and you all have the handbook, handout. So when we think about that lifespan approach, I want to think about ourselves. When did we start thinking about what we wanted to be when we grew up? Who were those role models? And how did we learn about those different careers? And what I've learned throughout is that we have young adults and adults that actually had a lot of influence of their families. Some were the schools. I have this activity right now. I'm teaching the transition course with teachers or future teachers, and I ask them to do this. I ask them to say, what is it you want to be when you grow up? Who taught you that? Who was that influence? Because what we know is there are many kids that don't have that influence, but that at that early age, at early childhood age, we should always be talking about the different jobs and careers that are out there. So that picture, that colorful picture of, I think it was at the end of kindergarten, this is my niece's daughter, Ava, that's like a granddaughter to me. And who can guess what this picture really is? Does anyone have any idea of what this picture is? Because if you do, that means Kathy will give you a trip to Bahamas. Just kidding. This was very early at her late of, I think she was about the end of her kindergarten year, and they were doing some career stuff. So this is her getting her hair cut. And for the longest time through kindergarten and first grade, all she wanted to be was a hairstylist. And that's because she loved the lady who cut her hair, Miss Kim. And to this day, she goes to see Miss Kim. She is now 11 years old. But we've sort of moved on from the hairstylist to she's now thinking of some other things. She doesn't know what she really wants to be, but her interests are changing. And I'm watching these interests change. But it's about having that exposure and really telling about it. So when I think about transition, that next slide talks about a unified framework for secondary transition education and services. And what this means is that when we talk about we want our loved ones and young adults to be included in all aspects of life, we want to make sure that we're looking at this from that unified framework. So I think about what is it that in the slide that has these four blue columns, sort of slide columns, I want you to, we think about what is it that happens with kids and when we think about that unified system. So we think about that kids have meaningful participation in that core curriculum with their neighborhood peers. They're building those relationships. And then when we think about transition planning, we look at what is available for all students. And you're going to hear me say it over and over, but what's happening is that it is that we need to supplement, not supplant what's already existing in the schools. And that when I talk about that shared responsibility is that we can't just rely on the families to do it all. We can't rely on the schools, that we must collaborate to make sure it really works. And then we can't do it unless we think about the social emotional learning of the kids and obviously understanding that culture. In the next slide, a unified framework for secondary transition services. Kath, I don't know if it's moving on or not. I'm not seeing it. So I'm just going to say what my slide is, and then if you can move it, great. So this unified framework, a colleague and I developed this little framework to think about what IDEA requires is post-secondary education, employment, and community life. That is what's under IDEA, that in that transition IEP, we must be preparing for kids. But what we think about is, then what is that structure? And so we definitely want the high academic rigorous standards, but we also want inclusive programming. We want that personalization. We want that career exploration for all kids, not just kids with disabilities. And what we know within that structure of schools are both internal and external supports. Those internal supports are the services that we know are available to all kids. School counseling, social workers. We know that sometimes there's some specialized services like our accommodations, special education, but we also know there's programs that all kids, including kids with disabilities, benefit from. The anti-bullying program, that mental health program, suicide prevention. And then we have external supports. And those community resources are what I call the one-stop centers, or our Work One centers that are available for all, making those social and community networks that are so important that we've learned over the years of families and friends, but neighborhoods, neighbors and churches. And then what are some of those community resources that could help students throughout that high school and program and to move on to graduation and have more of those success. Each community is a little different, but maybe it's a little tutoring kind of things. Maybe it's those some programs, the Chamber of Commerce has certain programs to help kids explore different jobs. And then there are times we need these unique disability services, vocational rehabilitation, mental health, developmental disabilities, and of course, services at post-secondary ed disability services. But in that next slide, I'll say it over and over. If we're going to look at those inclusive practices and have that unified system, we have to ensure that we need to find out what is currently happening for all students first. And then we say, what do we need that may supplement it, or that may we need to develop as a unique program? So when I think about that is, and you all have these slides, is for these guidelines, when we think about it, is we want to supplement, we don't want to supplant, because there's a lot that happens in gen ed, like career tech programs, and there are some pre-college kind of programs that go on that they're already making lots of connections in your local community. So let's not go and build one for disability only. Let's supplement what they're doing and build on as needed. And that we really have to be purposeful and deliberate throughout a child's life, from that early childhood through by the time we leave high school, looking at transition skills and activities, identifying those things that could really help inform the transition IEP planning process. And I'm going to get into that a little bit more next month. But that we also have to ensure that the special educator must understand the gen ed curriculum and build those relationships and coordination that is so critical, especially for those students who want to go on to post-secondary ed. So why do we do transition planning? What's the whole purpose? So it really is to help families and students to think about that desired future. It doesn't mean that you're not going to change your mind. It doesn't mean that things are going to go a little bit in a different route. But what is it that you want for your loved one? And how do you jointly plan those high school experiences that move to that desired future? Maybe it's to go on to college. Maybe it's to go to a community college. Maybe it's to go right into the workforce. So how do we look at our high school services to help build upon that? And for some students, they may need some service connections. Maybe it's the vocational rehabilitation. Maybe it's developmental disability services. So how do we make those connections, and when should we be making those connections? And most importantly, it's to create the coordinated set of activities that IDEA has in their definition, and services to help students and families make informed decisions. So we need to be able to have lots of different experiences so students and families can make that informed decision. So I sort of like to say that what we really want to do, and this is based after a lot of the work that the State Department of Bureau of Developmental Disability Services and Division of Disability and Rehabilitative Services is looking at, is how do we develop a vision for a good life? And what is that good life for that student and for their families? Because every good life will be a little different. So we want to make sure that the individual is achieving those self-determination skills and the interdependency, the productivities, and that we're looking at that inclusive approach to all facets of community life. And for families, how do we support families in ways that maximize their own capacities, their own unique abilities and strengths to best nurture and love and support the whole family as a whole unit? That's what the good life means for all. So how do we do that? And when we think about transition services and we're developing that good life, I'm not going to go through all of these, but one of the things that this is based off of the life course, charting the life course. And what I really appreciate about charting the life course is that it looks at the holistic approach, and that as we begin looking for that vision for the future, transition planning, we have to make sure that we don't forget about the social and spirituality piece, that for many students about the healthy living. What do they need from the medical piece or behavioral or even nutrition? And then of course, safety and security. Those things that every parent with and without a disability gets nervous about for their child. What do we need to have in place so that families know they have everything in place and that they could go to bed at night and sleep? Not that it's going to take the worry away, it'll always be there, but that you know you've done all you can to provide those. And then of course, really looking at that advocacy and engagement and looking at that holistic approach when we think about transition services. So where do I find this information? How do I even begin to think about this for my child? And I think one is that you as family members and caregivers and those closest to the student really knows who the student is and what they like. And then we like to do, and we'll talk about this a little bit more next month, about transition assessments, including authentic assessments, meaning those things that they do every day. What are those interests? What are those likes? What are those things that we could expose the student to help make that informed decision? And so the biggest thing that I would say here is those experiences, information, and knowledge. The more we expose students to a variety of things, and even after one of my, I think, most successful aspects of being a transition coordinator was after having a young man for 1.5 years on a variety of different jobs, a lot of different experiences. At the end, when we were getting ready to find that final placement, for him to go on to the world of work as an adult, he wasn't able to tell me what he really liked, but he definitely was able to tell me what he didn't like. And to me, that's successful, because we're learning about what works and what doesn't work, and we continue to build upon that. And so any of these things really help inform who this person is from a holistic approach. So in this next slide, it's about those sending and receiving systems. It's the hardest part for lots of people, including families, but that you leave a system based on entitlement, the Free and Appropriate Public Education through Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, to a system based on eligibility. And it becomes a maze. And the earlier you get involved in this, the more you can learn about this, the better. And although we continuously work through how do we simplify the navigation of all these systems, we continue to work hard on it. It still is a maze. So always to reach out to those people who've come before you and reach out. I'm here to just ask those questions, because I think the hardest thing is you don't even know the questions to ask or what to expect. And that's what we'll talk a little bit more about that next month as well. So in a very simplified way, I talk about making the match. And I say this around transition because it's much more, it's very complicated, complex for an individual's life. But what happens with a lot of our students is that they leave high school and they either go straight on to the world of work and maybe live with their parents for a while. They may find an apartment. Right now, I think in the world today, all young adults are spending more time with their families in their home. Other students go on to college, and it may be a training program, it may be a 2-year program, it may be a 4-year college. They may be getting supports, but they go to college, and after they finish their degree, then they begin their career and that life after that training. For other young adults, they need a little additional supports. They need more of those specified supports and services. So they go through the adult agencies, whether that be vocational rehabilitation, developmental disabilities, or the adult providers who provide these services to get that support to reach that goal of careers and that community life. But what I would say to families as you start learning about what are my questions I need to ask, what's the information I need, I always say we got to know where we're going before we're going to get there. So I'm going to just spend very quickly, 10 minutes or so talking about post-secondary education. I'm going to talk a little bit about employment and what happens around employment, and then a little bit about community life, independent living, which those are the three big post-secondary outcomes required by IDEA, and just what to think about that future and what's that trajectory for your own child or loved one or student, and then what are some things we need to be doing now to get ready for that. So what do we need to know about post-secondary education? You no longer are under IDEA, it goes away, and you're under what is called the 504 Rehabilitation Act or Americans with Disabilities Act, both of them. So it's really about access. That's the key word here. It's about access to those services. There is no such thing as curricular modifications in higher education. There's accommodations. So you may go somewhere else to take an exam. You may have tutors. You may have some alternative formats, audio or electronic, but you won't change the curriculum itself. You will still have to meet all those requirements. And so how this works is the student is expected to go to the Office of Disability Services, and they have to have the appropriate documentation. In most colleges, they are taking the IEP with some other maybe basic evaluations. Some get a little bit more stickier and want something more current. It really depends on your school. I think the key here is that the student has to initiate those accommodations. So, and they have to act as their own advocate. So as a faculty member, this semester it happened, I'm doing an online course, but the student said that she gets services from the Office of Disability Services. I do not know what that disability is. All I know is she's getting services, and what she's required or what she's allowed is extra time on a test. So as I've said to her, she has to communicate with me what she's going to need since it's an online course. For other students, they sometimes go somewhere to take that test and be free of any distractions. But the key is that own advocacy, and we'll come back to this probably a little bit more next month, but so important for young adults to know about their strengths and also their support needs so they can advocate for them. And there's a lot of things when you think about post-secondary education, what you need to consider. The number of classes to take in a semester. It's really overwhelming, and the workload is much higher than high school. What are the job prospects for the courses or the degree? And there are a lot of career programs within universities that could help them, but that's important. How do you make this match? The size of the college and classes. For some individuals, they can handle the Indiana University undergraduate, like Biology 101, that may have 100 kids in the class, where other students need a smaller campus and smaller classes. They really have to understand those academic expectations where it's not going to be that they're going to be requiring a lot more reading, a lot more writing. And there's others that, depending on what they're looking at. The other thing is that it's really important that they understand that the time management piece of it, that it's not like I go to school every day from 8 o'clock to 3 o'clock. I'm out now maybe taking classes at different schedules, different days. I may have a day that I don't have a class. So what do you do during that time? Time management is a struggle for all freshmen, but obviously it becomes really important for students who really struggle with those type of issues. The other thing is that I've learned over the years that a lot of kids who have maybe on an IEP, they like to shed that stigma associated with special education. And that's good and bad. The good is they're trying to move forward without it. The bad news is sometimes they really do need those supports. And so they need to be able to learn what that disability is and how it impacts their everyday life. Maybe it doesn't, maybe it does, but they have to learn where it does. As my student who just emailed me last night, and there was a change of medication and she hasn't turned in some homework. And my response to her was, I understand all of that, but as becoming your own self-advocate, you need to communicate with me when it starts, not 3 weeks after that you're having difficulty. And so one of the ways you really learn about all that is to really be actively involved in your transition planning process and being part of that transition IEP, so we can really teach those good self-advocacy skills. I'm not going to spend a lot of time in this next slide that talks about Think College. I encourage you all to go to the website, thinkcollege.net. Established back in 2010, legislation at the federal level started for people to have some higher ed, inclusive higher ed options for students with intellectual disability. And they have expanded. We have about 300 programs across the country. There's about 6 in Indiana. Some are connected with schools, other for just the adult level of it. You have to be out of high school. So we're seeing really good results. I think it is, we continue to look at that employment piece of it because that's our ultimate goal. But I would encourage you to learn more about it. And I think the best part of it is that kids, young adults are with their, it's age appropriate peers. They're in inclusive classes. A real theme of it is about the career development piece. That is probably one of the biggest components that we want these classes and activities to really lead to that employment piece. And I'm going to leave you with this slide that really talks a lot about some of the resources you may need. I would encourage you, something from the Center on Community Living and Careers is College for You, is a wealth of information about resources, both federally and at the state level, and questions to think about when you're looking at it. There's also the collegeboard.org. So I'm going to take a deep breath here. We're going to shift from going on to leaving school to higher education or 2 years, 4-year colleges, and move a little bit quickly to employment. Ultimately, we want all individuals to be contributing to their communities to the level they can contribute, whether it's part-time, full-time, with and without benefits. That is our key, is employment. And employment is a priority at our State Department of Division of Disability and Rehabilitative Services. We're really honing in on what is it going to take to help support more young adults to leave school with jobs and to keep those jobs, and to make sure as adults they continue. So here's just some considerations when you're thinking about it. Learning those skills and preferences, interests, and needs of the student. And the way we do that is through a lot of work-based learning, volunteering, exposing students to a lot of different settings, and identifying what works and what doesn't work. Are there specific work settings or positions that really match this student's skills? If a student has a lot of sensory issues, we don't want to put them in a manufacturing plant that has a lot of loud noises. We want to continue to develop those realistic yet high expectations, talents versus job demands and needs. And I always, when I look at this slide, I always think of a teacher I was working with who she got frustrated with a student. They were doing some transition assessments, trying to identify some interests. And she said to me, every time I do that, all he does is put his head down, and the only thing he wants to talk about is going out to find the Loch Ness Monster. And so I looked at her, and I think she thought I was I had a couple screws, not all the way tight. And I said, so what's he learned about it? And she goes, what do you mean? I said, well, has he done any research about what it means to go find the Loch Ness Monster? And so she was sort of thinking, okay, she really has gone off. But when you Google that, there are pages and pages and pages about the Loch Ness Monster. And when you really dig into it, it's about tourism. And so again, I left there saying, I don't know if it's realistic or not. It's not my job as a professional to tell someone what they can and can't do. My job is to help them make that informed decision. And the only way you do that for all kids, all individuals, is allow them to do that research. Let them explore it. And maybe they like tourism, but do they know tourism also involves a lot of social interactions? Do you know what else it means? And so again, like a lot of students, they may change their minds along the way the more they learn about it. So it's really important that we keep those high expectations. Or the student who, we always have the students, we talk about the NFL and the NBA, but wanted to be part of the WWF, wanted to go, be a wrestler. And lo and behold, he did his research, and there's a school in Georgia that helps train for those wrestlers. And again, that's up to that family with them, but those are the kind of research and exposures that we need to make sure students are doing to make the informed decisions. The other piece is to understand that work culture and the requirements, and work cultures are very different, but we have some that are extremely supportive and some that are very relaxed, where others are a little bit more conservative in ways that, you wear the ties and the suits and everybody whispers. So making those good matches or what it's about, and during those high school years, and even beyond, we have to have a lot of those experiences to help make that good job match. So a couple work considerations, this next slide here, is the environmental conditions. We want to think about inside, outside, temperatures, noise levels, and lighting distractions. And it's very important for individuals who have those sensory issues. We need to understand that. The physical demands. For someone who needs to move a lot, we need to find those jobs that they either can get up and take those breaks, or get up and part of that job is moving and walking, and that's important. Are they able to lift? Are there any fine and gross motor skill issues? And then of course the attributes, the judgments of safety rules that may need to happen. We have the social skills that have to require. So all of that helps make about that good job match so that we meet the needs of that employer. The employers don't do this because it's a nice thing to do. We add value to that place, and that's what's important. And then finally, we talk about part of IDEA's post-secondary goals is, again, post-secondary education and training, employment, and finally, independent living or life skills. And it's not about where someone's going to live. It's about those skills to access your community, to access recreation and spirituality, and just volunteering and being a part of a community. And so those skills are just as critical for all kids. And we do know that, we're on a college campus, you could tell some of those undergraduates who really could benefit for a little bit more life skills and making good decisions. That's all part of growing, and the more of those experiences. So I gave a really brief overview of all this. I'm hoping there's some questions. Next month, what I'm going to talk a lot about is the transition IEP planning process and what should be happening starting at that age 14, and for some schools older, and how it should look and evolve over each of those years. And then getting into some of those specifics of those expectations beyond that high school. So with that, Kath, I thought I'd just stop for a moment and see if people have questions.
Yeah, there's a couple questions, Teresa, and I think one is a comment. I have found in speaking with young adults is that the change from high school to the real world, they are shell-shocked with the change in routine and schedule. This is a huge change for them in structure. And then the other one is, I think, trying to find some help. My son is a junior in high school, and I'm trying to find someone to help us prepare for his transition plan. The school will prepare the transition IEP in October. However, I need help finding someone who can work with my son and help us figure out what services, programs, etc. are best for him. How do I know what his strengths are? How do we know what will be best for him, etc.? I'm not necessarily looking for a free program. I feel lost and need a mentor. Where can I find someone who will work with us and help with the transition plan? And 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 there was another that was also stated by another one. I feel lost and I need a mentor. I'm in the exact same place for the last several years. This is so important. The parents need help.
Let me go back to all of it. Those are really, really good comments. The first one, the real world shock is, and I think that we find this even with the typical undergraduates, especially if they come from smaller communities, but being on a big campus. And I always think of the words my nephew, he's now 42, but when he went to college, he looked at me and said, "You mean my mom and dad aren't going to know what time I come home?" And it's like, no. And if I go to class or not, I'm like, yeah, eventually when you fail, they're going to know what's going on. And so the more we could help prepare for those generalization into that world of what life is like, and giving young adults those responsibilities of making their lunches and getting themselves up and what it's going to be like. Sometimes it may take the real world to make that happen, but the more we could try to do our best, and I think we think about this for all kids, that we're always really worried about them. For the two that are just feeling lost, obviously I am more than happy to help you and assist you in any way I can. It's sometimes when I know where the school is, it helps me even more. I would also, there are people at InSource that the Parent Center that does quite a bit around transition. In fact, there are two family liaisons that are doing a lot around youth and are focusing on transition, that are helping to do some self-determination training with youth, but also would know those schools and understand and could walk you through them. I would be happy to have a conversation with you all just to say, have you thought about this and this, and think through some of the transition IEP planning process. When it comes to even finding out your child's strengths, and finding out, what they like, I would hope that the schools would be able to tell you some of that. And, and knowing what kind of questions to ask them of, what are those experiences been? And what other experiences can he or she have? We get challenged a lot for students who spend all their time in the gen ed curriculum only because finding that time, but all high schools have access to pre-employment transition services that is funded through vocational rehabilitation. And they are typically delivered by an adult service provider, but sometimes some other means. It just depends on where you're living. And they do a lot of work around after school and at summertime and doing some work-based learning experiences. And so that would be another place that I would highly encourage your child to get involved with, to get those experiences and exposures to try to determine what they like and what they don't like. So definitely.
Okay, we're going to just take one other comment and then we'll have to close out. For those of you who are still on, if you go into the chat, there's a survey that you can complete and then you'll get a certificate for this presentation. And the chat should also have a link to the handouts as well. And the next webinar that Teresa is doing is actually going to be on March 7th, so a month from now. And we hope that the technology works out a little bit smoother. And thank you all so much for your patience. I hope you have found this to be as worthwhile as I have. So Julie Threadgill just says, I recently began a position as a transition coordinator at an independent living center in Southern Indiana, and she's gone through the parent training program with InSource. So there's lots of resources.
Can I say something there? Each of the independent living centers have done a lot more around transition to help supplement all the other, because the need is so great. And so depending on where you live, but I'm working closely with the one up in Fort Wayne right now, but they will help support you through the IEP process and or through the transition piece of it. So thank you, Julie, for helping to remind me of that. And so another person I see, Kathy, says, we often speak about the dignity of risk and supported independent building with remote support services and assistive technology. And yes, yeah, the whole dignity of risk piece is huge, and we could be talking hours about that. But learning technology is very important for lots of different reasons, especially from that support.
I think the rest are just thank yous. So Teresa, thank you so much.